Hello, I hope my message finds you well. Whether you are in the past, sometimes before the year 2020, or throughout the troubled years of the pandemic, or even already in the future ahead of my times. I am Raluca, yet I am known here by the name of Ara, a name I received from my community when this story I'm going to tell you about started. Short from Arachne, this name was meant to connect me in a deeper way with nature, but it also signifies my skill of weaving plans and strategies into which people are trapped, yet most of them without regretting. It is such a plan that started to materialize 7 years ago, in 2021. However, before going into that story, I want to share with you my enthusiasm from today, the 5th of November 2028. A 5th of November we will all remember, and not because the building of the British Parliament was blown into millions of pieces. Although that too happened several years ago as a public art intervention in commemoration of the slave trade victims, and what a rewarding fireworks spectacle that was. Today it's a different kind of celebration now, as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was elected President of the United States. Well, at least of those states that are still part of the Union, after Florida was erased by the big tsunami, Alaska was flooded by the melting icebergs, and Oregon became the autonomous rebel state of QAnon. Coming closer to where I am now, I should probably mention that the entire south of Romania was engulfed by the advancing sands, turning entire fields and cities into deserts. As a result, Bucharest counts now more than 5 million people, a city which was hardly ever prepared to host barely half of that. This process also determined the Great Escape. Those who could afford it left up north to the mountains or at least to the countryside, going away from the permanent fog from the city and the constant traffic jams. In addition, Bucharest also lost the title of capital of the country. Since we can no longer fly, it proved quite useless as a strategic city, and the capital moved to Constanța, a port city by the Black Sea, presenting obvious advantages. Nevertheless, Bucharest is still an interesting place, with many pockets of resistance and people who defy the odds and the times, so we didn't want to go too far away from that. I'm jumping stages here. It feels like there have been centuries since the time before the pandemic in 2019, when we sensed the first waves of the deep societal earthquake that was to come. Back then we had a prototype garden, where we grew few vegetables, many herbs, some weeds, and countless utopian ideas. We were tolerated there rather than settled, as we were above a swamp and nature was sending emissaries to collect its tribute. Snails, thousands of them, and smelling bugs, millions of them. We fed oranges to the snails and we stopped cultivating tomatoes, which were the bugs' honey, as strategies to cope with this. Yet we knew it was temporary and some other form of catastrophe would follow. One day this just fell out of the sky in the form of a bulldozer. Our neighbor had sold his property, and in the place of the house that used to be there since we arrived, a block of flats appeared, crushing both our view and our hopes for the future. Maybe we could have lived with it if they didn't cut the trees. We could have hoped the swamp would ask for its tribute from them too, that the new building would shake and fall before being completed. But all our hopes vanished when our good old friend the ailanthus, the tree which used to guard us from the corner of the garden for 7 years, was suddenly gone in one day. We let it be and left. When we pass by that place today, instead of our garden, there is now a big concrete parking lot on 5 floors. So rather than ailanthuses and vegetables, our former neighbors open their windows to see some old pieces of junk metal, squeezing smoke from their ashes every time they start the engine. Never mind, This was anyway so long ago that I'm surprised I remember such details, especially that what followed our departure from that space was so fast and so vast. A year and a half of pandemic, followed by 2 years of drought, a medium-sized earthquake and mass migration from the southern areas. Pollution to unseen levels, even by South Asian standards. Former high-rise office buildings turned into luxury condo apartments, sold to sheikhs and former ISIS generals. After they bought the entire riverfront in Belgrade, Bucharest was the next safest, unrestricted place for their necromantic businesses. And on top of everything, the giant bells of the Salvation Cathedral, tolling every half an hour as honks of the apocalypse. As a consequence, the Museum of Contemporary Art in the courtyard of the cathedral had to move all its exhibitions and stuff in the basement, where luckily there is a labyrinth of long corridors built before 1989, so suddenly they had so much more space. It wasn't such a bad move after all. And not to forget the big freeze from 2024, when it was so cold that people burned all the IKEA furniture in their houses, albeit to not much caloric effect. The good side of that is that it's a real pleasure to visit people's homes today and see all the different solutions they had to invent after the pre-packed lives they used to have. Well, enough of the misfortunes that swooped over Bucharest. They were just the overspilling of an already doomed city, which we were set to leave ever since we arrived in it for the first time. Only that it doesn't work that easily. Such a city is a perverse organism which feeds on its inhabitants. It controls them with some very simple means, such as a piece of stone shining in the sunset, the sound of the tramway at 5 in the morning, a glimpse to the lives of the neighbors across the street, a broken armchair keeping a parking place occupied, the deafening yet comforting noise of the children playing in the kindergarten courtyard, the eyelash and lipstick on the drugstore shelves. I could count to 100,000 ways in which the city can keep one captive in its threads, and I would only just begin. It was already late when we left Bucharest in the summer of 2021. Apart from our experience and our fears, we hardly had anything. Moreover, we were going to a place that was already gentrified, privatized to the last inch, with the lake almost completely made inaccessible by the private properties built on its shores, with yachts and motorboats destroying the habitats and the water lilies, with golf courses replacing the former cornfields. Yet, the place was still a village, and we were counting that in times of crisis, the peasant spirit would be a comfort and a refuge, irrespective of how much these peasants from the vicinity of Bucharest had lost their true, authentic soul. We were determined to teach them about permaculture where they couldn't teach us about agriculture. But most of all, we had nothing to lose. The draft was announced by meteorologists, so we wondered what would we eat. In late 2010s, mushrooms were very fashionable. In theory, Anna Tsing's interdisciplinary explorations of the matsutake mushroom were circulated like sparkles of gold in the academic vocabulary. Or in science and popular culture. For example, mycologist Paul Edward Stamets' work in studying mushrooms networks inspired an eponymous character in Star Trek television series, and the direction for possibilities of fast travel using spore drives. And when you think that today the anti-travel movement would ban even the imagination of such speed. And not least, mushrooms were present in art. Artists were literally growing mushroom experiments in their fridges. With the perspective of the draft, though, they were not a promising source of food, neither for the stomach nor for thought, despite the nearby forest, where a harsh fight against potential fires was to be carried. Even the lake was announcing itself in need for radical protection rather than as a valuable commodity in the way it had been used by that time. There was something inexplicable in our fear of hunger. For we were the generation who had grown up with grandparents in the countryside, with mothers cooking non-stop, and with exhibition openings where rivers of wine and prosecco were flowing. It was maybe something ancestral, some collective anguish that made us tremble at the very thought that nothing can be put on the table. So when we left the city, we were determined to make the soil produce for us a bounty full of edible fruit, not taking into account that the land we bought was heavily damaged by the corn monoculture that had been cultivated on it for years, and surely not expecting the drought would be so severe. We used to believe that if people went to Mars, they would have cultivated potatoes. In the end, thanks to the nationalization of SpaceX, the Mars plan was cancelled indefinitely, and the space program repurposed to better uses, mainly interstellar communication, but also in-depth research of microorganisms that can clean the oceans of plastic and other types of pollution. Yet our trust in the resilience of the potato was unabated. As we were very eager to try different varieties in each of our plant crops, we had the luck to plant also Solanum tuberosum indigena, a drought-resistant Andean potato, which saved both us and the villagers, and they are now cultivating it every year alongside other varieties, having learned not to rely solely on their traditional crops. Another positive outcome of the draft was that one of our associated researchers, a marine biologist, could study the diatoms on the dried up part of the lake, an opportunity she could not have benefited from otherwise. Today, we not only have bird-friendly windmills, systems for storing rainwater and recycling graywaters, but we can produce our own water in micro-rainforests, so none of our plants are suffering from thirst anymore. In memory of those days, though, we keep in the corner of the herbs garden a rosemary bush that was with us from the beginning, surviving all the wretchedness of those years, which we watered by saving in turns a bit from each of our water rations. Of course, we were not the first ones to evade the city. We were actually part of a big movement that had started before people had such pressing reasons as the pandemic or the draft. And many of us were those who had never actually belonged to a city such as Bucharest, who were always uneasy with its ways and its arrogance of a classist and unfair urban agglomeration, for it couldn't even be called a proper metropolis, lacking that necessary mix of cosmopolitanism and limitlessness. So relocating as a commune to a commune was a natural step to take. The moment to do it was rather prophetic, but as years passed, we learned to be at ease with our intuitions, premonitions, feelings, and non-rational connections to things and critters, to time and to other people. We have our treasured moments from this adventure here, such as the moment when half of our collective was a candidate for the job of mayor 4 years ago and had all televisions interview them. Unfortunately, not for their progressive views, but because they were a collective running for what is perceived as a one-man job. They came out second from 3 candidatures. Quite an achievement. And this proved a great PR move, which helped us being known by every soul in the village. Some of us are artists, the kind of artists who are rather attached to conceptual practices. We're used to the milieu made possible by institutions in the city. They were completely not interested in plein air practices, nor in community kind of work. Yet they are the darlings of the people in the village today. They teach at the local school and they organize the best interactive film screenings. Not to mention that botanists rely on them for the archiving of their work, which is now well beyond the old-fashioned botanical drawings. For example, botanists now know how to embody the plant's movements, and they archive their own movements in addition to time-lapse recordings of the actual plants. It was one of the artists in our community working with choreography and interspecies body awareness who was responsible for this shift. Another artist knows the language of crows, draws extinct species, and builds special roads for the tendrils of passiflora to climb on. Some are the mushroom experts, but also charting space debris, which is now visible in the sky with an open eye. Our decolonial member of the community, who was also in charge with smuggling in the Andean potato, was the mentor of and has now a seat of honor at the Assembly of the Local Women Council and Tribunal, which is administering most of the riddles and misunderstandings occurring in the village. Sometimes they are even invited as consultants to Bucharest. Another artist who was with us from the beginning was a specialist in the end of time. He is editor of the local newspaper now, called 2012, and cooks very good masala specialties. Another member of the cooperative is coaching the local football team and running a phytopharmacy, while yet another is translating old dialects and doing therapy for dysfunctional nuclear families, collecting their stories in temporary weird books. We also have the best wedding planner and organizer who speaks Romanian and Moldavian, in addition to 5 other languages, and who makes perfect blueberry wine. The karaoke master, whose repertoire includes Byzantine choral music and South Korean pop. The tarot card reader, who also managed to set up a radio station that transmits live from Azerbaijan, Armenia, Russia, and Kyrgyzstan. And our anthropologist, who can tell about each of the villagers, the decorations in their houses, their relatives, and stories, and who is also a trustworthy enthusiast. Not to forget one of our long-term friends who joined us even though he didn't need to, and who constantly reminded us how to cultivate our desires. We have our Marxists who still think we did a mistake buying the land instead of simply reclaiming it from the claws of private property. They are right, but we did not have another 30 years to reverse the post-89 period of savage capitalism of the East. We have our guests from the city who are constantly discontent that we are not welcoming enough, not inclusive enough, not educational enough. They are also right, but we took so much time tendering for the soil that we didn't pay enough attention to the rest of our work. There are the permaculture radicals who taught us to give up the tractors, and we got their point. We are all vegan, but we still cook our meals, and we actually enjoy firewood whenever we have discarded old wood that we did not have to cut. Most of all, we were really on our own. We did not have backups, no inheritances to rely on, no apartment in the city which to rent in order to secure some monthly allowance. Not all of us had children, and all of us discarded religion, so it was hard to become accepted in this place. I still wonder how not only we survived, but we assimilated and transformed the place. It now looks like a finely designed spider web, and we are happy every time someone decides to remain trapped therein.